Okay, here we go. Our first recorded lecture for Lifespan Development, Chapter 1. We're using the Odyssey, an Advanced Lifespan Adventure for Counseling Professionals by Erford. Sometimes when you push the button, it won't go. And we're starting with Chapter 1. Important Fundamental Principles of Lifespan Development. So the first chapter is really an overview of what this course is going to be like. And basically what we're doing is going through all the stages of life. It's really important that you understand these developmental stages of life so that you can understand your clients. There are overlapping systems and relationships that occur in each category. It's important to understand what developmental milestones are normal and what might be abnormal, and to be able to differentiate those things. So let's talk about each one for just a second. Prenatal is in the womb, conception until birth. This is where major organ development takes place and is different than infancy, which is birth to 2 years. There are different types of sensory motor and cognitive development that occurs in infancy before you get into toddlerhood. In toddlerhood is when children start to gain mastery of language. There's potty training, things like that. This is like 2 to 3 years old. And then you go into early childhood. This is basically 3 to 6 years old, refining that sensory motor control, making sure, starting to have language and independent language and control and more memory. And I can attest to this because I have a 9 and a 5 year old, and my 5 year old is about to turn 6. And I've seen a lot of changes in him lately. His memory is unbelievable, and he's definitely very independent. He wants to do everything himself, but he's regressed a little bit in the pandemic because he wants help every morning getting dressed. And if I didn't understand that, that could make me angry. But I do understand that things are different. And so while he is starting to have more understanding of the world, he's still not into that concrete way of thinking. And so the pandemic can be scary, coronavirus can be scary. And as much as we've done to try to explain things to him, that he's still having some symptoms of course, we're all going through a trauma, but he's having some symptoms. Um, so regression and wanting me to help him get dressed when he can get dressed himself is one of those examples of something that you would be able to look at in these different stages of life and go, oh, that makes sense as to why the child might be regressing a little bit right now. And then you go into early childhood. This is where, I'm sorry, middle childhood. I got lost in my story. Middle childhood is 6 to 12. This is where kids start to think more logically and concretely. And my 9 year old daughter is definitely able to do that. She has been able to handle the information about the pandemic far better than my 5 year old because she really starts, she's almost 10. And she gets in it, she has a grasp on this concept that we are safe to a point, etc. So she can understand it better. And then we get into good old adolescence, 12 to 19. The mental disorder is really important to note in adolescence. Mental disorders, that's when they begin, 12 to 19 years old. A lot of them start then. Some researchers have expanded the age of adolescence to 22 in different cultures. Look at adolescence and these periods a little differently. Always important to make sure that we are looking at the cultural aspects of the stages of life for a particular culture. But even as of late, we know that brain research has shown the brain to really be growing, especially that prefrontal cortex until 24. So I think even some researchers and some articles are saying that it's 24, that 18 to 24 is a critical period in substance abuse treatment because of where the brain is. It's very difficult to treat an 18 to 24-year-old because of the lack of prefrontal cortex. So you'll learn more about that in the substance abuse class and probably in this text, but just wanted to go ahead and let you know that now. Young adulthood. This is 19 to 30. I take a little bit of issue with that. I'm not a young adult anymore. I can't believe that. this is where you start to establish your career and maybe get married or you seek out some kind of other intimate relationship or your partner. Um, so it's often marked by, settling down, finding that partner for life, and maybe even starting a family. And then you go into middle adulthood, which is the longest lifespan, and it's from 30 to 60 years old. Um, Family can become very important. You can become really successful in your career. Late adulthood is 60 to 75, and that is you're nearing the end of your career, launching children, maybe having some grandkids, etc. Start to reflect on your life, and you can see the similarities of these stages with Erickson, which you remember from theories and other courses you've had already, and you can start to see how this makes sense. And then we finally have old age, and this is over 75, and now people are living longer, or they were. And there's a retirement, loss of spouse, loss of friends, a lot of things that happen in that period. Um, all right, keep going. Say the aging process. The aging process is not just biological, but it's also psychological and social. So there's different ways to look at biological aging, at the aging process, at um, we can be, so for example, we could be 75, but we might be running the Boston Marathon. And we may be hanging out and traveling and doing all sorts of things. So our psychological and social age is very low. Maybe we are 45, but our biological age says we're 75. Or maybe our biological age says we're 50 and the psychological and social is 80. So it's important to understand that because you don't want to stereotype someone when they come in your office to see you because of an age. I mean, it really is interesting when you think about how old you feel, how old you act, etc. Like, for instance, I'm 42, but I feel like I'm 30, 29. Maybe I don't always act that way, but I think some of you could probably relate to this with your families, your friends, and yourselves if you stop and think about it for a second. So there's two types of aging, um, and when we talk about those two terms that you need to know, anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism involves our body building up to that peak biological performance. So it doesn't mean that we're all going to meet that at the same time. Okay, so some of us may not have met it yet, and some may have already met it. It depends a lot on our socioeconomic status and what type of resources we have. So someone who does well and financially and can afford to have healthy food and go to the gym and have like tennis or play some kind of sport or walk with friends, they're probably going to reach that or they're going to peak at a much later time than someone who is in poverty and is working for minimum wage and has 4 kids. And I mean, they're going to meet that sooner. They're going to have that biological peak performance sooner. It's from birth until we peak, and it's highly valued in our society. People try to sustain that anabolic growth for as long as possible. And I think everybody's aware of that. But after you reach the peak of that, you slowly start to deteriorate, which is catabolism. And it varies until death for all of us, obviously. More stress and anxiety and things like that are going to cause that to happen sooner. So in the book, it talks about anabolic steroids, and I thought that was just interesting because so many people are so focused, especially if you look right now, and everyone's focused on this anabolism and for us to stay young physically. Um, People will go to great lengths to stay attractive and young. High performance and attractiveness are valued, and decline is delayed at any cost sometimes. So it's interesting to note. So psychological aging is very different. This is how old an individual feels, the perception of their age, okay? So um, examples in the book are an adolescent girl who becomes pregnant and has to become a mother at a young age. But then I talked about earlier a 65-year-old who exercises every day, maybe runs marathons, and they feel younger. My grandmother, when she was 90, said she still felt 25 in her head. In a lot of ways, she acted like it, which is why I loved her so much. And I think a lot of you probably think of people in your own lives, like I said. Social aging is very different, and it's very different among cultures and societies. So, professionals gain prestige as they age a lot of times in their fields, like professors and doctors, lawyers, etc., um, than the retired factory worker. So, a lot more respect for that profession. Um, in New Zealand, as in many other cultures, becoming a grandmother is a significant marker of being considered old. People in Turkey saw themselves as old at a younger age than Americans did. So the perception is different among cultures, and it's really important for you to understand that because when you're counseling, you need to be aware of what that is. So women especially fear physical changes associated with age. Um, Aging anxiety and media exposure can predict motivation for and consideration of cosmetic surgery. So it's very, the cultural impact for women is very different than men. Men aging is seen in our Western society as a very positive thing. And for women, it's not so much. So it's a big fear of aging and stigma, etc. Yeah. One more thing I wanted to say about this before I move to this next section is East Asian cultures, much respect for people who are old, and respect increases with age. So be aware of your own stereotypes for age and making sure that you understand these different cultural norms. So the nature of development. So human development is a lot of different things. Human development is cumulative, variable, cyclical, and repetitive, influenced by cultural differences, characterized by individual differences, and characterized by both stability and change. Oh, so the cumulative effect is just what it sounds like, cumulative, over time. So early developmental delays and early developmental issues have a cumulative effect on later development. This is especially true in the trauma work that I do. When you have extensive trauma in early childhood, it has an effect. Think about attachment disorders, right? Think about what we know about these things, but it's also variable. It depends on the individual, it depends on when it happened and who was there. It depends on so many things. We now know that, for instance, trauma is genetic and environmental. So lots of factors here on the outcome in the future. Human development is also cyclical and repetitive in ways, right? There are certain lifespans that we experience gains and losses in each of those stages. All school-age children at some point start to gain that logical thought, that ability, right, around a certain time. Um, and so there are some things that are cyclical and also repetitive. We're also all influenced by cultural differences. So all of these onsets could be delayed depending on what culture you're from. So examples in the book is infant babbling is universal, but the onset can be delayed. Even though the onset is delayed, even babies born with deafness across the world learn to babble. That that suggests that babies have an innate trait that exists cross-culturally. However, there are many aspects of development that are highly influenced by the culture which one is raised in. One really good example of this is how European Americans characterize spanking as a really bad punishment, right? Perceive it to be scary and that it causes negative outcomes. But in the African American culture, children view spanking as a decent and normal parenting practice. Culture affects the parenting practice. So if you have a client who comes in who's African American that uses spanking, that is not something that you try to change. You support and understand that that is a part of the culture, and there's a lot of reasons for that. For instance, back in when the times of slavery were occurring, and even up until now, women would go ahead and beat their own child to get them to behave versus them die. I went to an interesting lecture some years ago about that, about the development of that type of punishment for them, because they were on a plantation and they were slaves and the child was acting up, they could just sell the child or they could kill the child. So horrific. So it has developed historically from a place of protection. If I go ahead and do this punishment here, I can save my child out there. And that you see how that's transitioned in with police and things such as that today. So I think that is a very important example for all of you. Um, Corporal punishment in some cultures is totally acceptable, in others is not as acceptable. So remember those fun terms, emic and etic. Etic. So remember, as helping professionals, we should strive to be emic, have an emic cultural specific view. We understand the practices and behaviors behind the culture of our client. Our etic are universal. It would really limit us because we would take a global look and think and not understand. It wouldn't be as individualized. So that's a universal perspective, and IMIC is culture specific. That will be on the NCE and a multitude of other tests for you. So it's important that you just go ahead and know it. We learned it in foundations. We're reviewing it now. And then here are we, characterized by individual differences. Of course, I just talked about this. Genetics, right? Environment. I love this example. I love the brain. So it's talking about there was a study here in London taxi drivers. And they have to rely on a lot of spatial development to drive around in that city. I don't know if any of you have been to London, but it's traffic and the navigation is pretty crazy over there. And they ruled out the possibility that those with greater hippocampal volume sought out. Wait, I'm sorry. They have increased gray matter in the posterior hippocampus from that driving and learning, right? So they increase that hippocampal volume in their brain. So it's an incredible amount of spatial navigation required by those taxi drivers. So our individual differences clearly play a role. So we are finding that out in all the research with trauma. We are in the workshop that I do, I discuss this. So we are all born with a predisposition for maybe suppressed cortisol or increased cortisol, etc. And how that interplays with us in our environment. Maybe we have a supportive, loving, nurturing environment. We get in therapy early, and that suppressed cortisol doesn't matter. So, or perhaps we are born into a stressful environment. We don't have enough to eat. Well, that's going to play into the suppressed cortisol. So it's really, really important to understand everybody's different. And I could tell you that every client I've ever seen is different. They can come in with the same diagnosis and it won't matter. They are different. Their diagnosis is different and their story is different, and how they all interplay. It's really important how vastly different we are. Also, human development is characterized by both stability and change. So there are a lot of dichotomies within lifespan developments. We're going to go through a lot of those in just a minute, but you see here that development is characterized by both stability and change. And that can be confusing. So, hey, which is it? Well, it's both. Some things are stable throughout our life, like our intelligence, unfortunately. And some things change, like our memory, depending on when we get older and we might start to lose our memory. So some things remain pretty stable and some things don't. And it's important for you to understand that as we move forward. All right. This is important principles and issues. And I was talking about the opposites here. So there's multiple dichotomies in developmental science. So as we go through this, I just want you to keep an open mind and understand these concepts as we go through. Again, this is just an introductory first chapter, but it's going to help you throughout the whole course to understand these concepts. So discontinuous versus continuous. So the discontinuous is basically saying we go through these stages and then they're abruptly finished. So each stage is characterized by new behaviors, new cognitions, and emotions that are fundamentally different from the previous stage, and it's abrupt. And regardless of the speed at which people move through the stages, all people are willing to progress through them in a fixed order. So, like a staircase in the book, it shows like a discontinuous example is a staircase, and I really think that's important for you to understand it. Like the stages of development, boom, 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 like stairs. But in contrast, theorists who view development as continuous believe that developmental change is continually occurring at a gradual, steady pace. An example of quantitative incremental growth would be a child adding a new word to his vocabulary. Learning the meanings of new words does not require large-scale changes. Rather, it enables the child to build on existing knowledge. So rather than moving like abruptly through a staircase, it looks more like a smooth upward progression. And in your text, you can see that those figures on page 9, figure 1-1, and page 10, figure 1-2. So the majority of psychologists now believe development is characterized by both. Which makes sense, right? So the continuity discontinuity issue is also related to the perceptions of whether or not the personality traits of a young child and the effects of early experiences will persist across time. For example, do you guys believe that a defiant oppositional child will become a defiant oppositional adult? Or do you believe the environment the child grows up in will determine whether those traits persist or change over time? Is it likely that some personality traits are resistant to change? What about the practices and cultural norms, etc.? So you can see how this can be a convoluted issue, but both is the answer. Let's look at the case of Joey on 1.1. Joey is a 17-year-old 12th grader. He's struggling about graduation. His parents have really pressured him and they wanted him to be in the medical field like his father, but he's really introverted. They didn't let him do a lot of extracurriculars or anything. He struggles in math and science, but he doesn't want to upset his parents. So if you subscribe to a discontinuous view of development, what role would that be? Like Erickson, it'd be identity versus role confusion. He is definitely dealing with confusion as he attempts to establish his social and occupational identity. Identity versus role confusion. A rigid view of when people should enter and resolve each stage could prevent you from considering that Joey is also struggling to resolve guilt about choosing goals that conflict with his parental expectations, but that he has not sufficiently mastered social and academic skills, right? This guy's not been socialized. Was pretty scary. He's not for him. He hasn't had any extracurriculars or friend time. So if you subscribe to the continuous view of development, which is the what we just went over, you may view Joey's problems quite differently. You may notice that his unresolved social identity mirrors his unresolved occupational identity. Perhaps Joey has not been given sufficient opportunities to learn social skills or advance academic skills. It's also possible that his avoidance and complacency have been reinforced by his parents, and those behaviors are no longer working for him. This continuous view would be helpful in understanding the contextual influences on Joey's behavior, but it would obscure any potential stage issues that might be influencing Joey's problems. So you see the two and how they're different. It's important how you view this as a counselor, knowing your personal biases. Taking a multidimensional view of Joey's situation to examine all the factors and avenues would be advantageous. So I think a comprehensive view from both angles is really the best way to go. Okay, let's move on. I know this is so fun. Now everybody's ready to get back in the classroom. All right, and then we have predictable and historical changes. We're going through all of these. So normative age-graded influences. These are the predictable changes that everyone will encounter throughout the lifespan. And this just means there are certain things that happen in our lives that in a certain age range usually occurs, like menopause or puberty, right? It's universal. So about the time you begin school, It slightly varies, but it's pretty standard within a couple of years. So that normative age graded influences. And then we have normative history graded influences. And it's an interesting time to teach this because if you read this, it talks about the impact of things like the Great Depression, 9/11, which I remembered greatly impacted me and maybe some of you. If you were older, yes, some of you were alive then. Um, so right now, what is happening with COVID-19 and this pandemic? Where you are, think about where you are. You're in graduate school. How did this change everything for us, for our children, right? What kind of influence? How would this change them? I already told you about my son regressing some, and we're wearing masks, right? I'm wearing a mask. When we go out, we're wearing a mask. If we go to the store, um, that's going to be next time somebody writes this book. That's going to be in here, and that's kind of neat. But it's very interesting for us to learn in this time. So think about history, fate, and influence. How's it affecting us, right? From here on out, what's going to be different? Social distancing is a new word. Washing our hands, wearing masks. And then we have non-normative or highly individual life events. These are unusual occurrences that greatly affect an individual's life. The death of a parent, the death of a sibling, something positive like winning the lottery. It will vastly affect your development. So now I want you to do an activity, and this will be the thing that this will be what I want you to respond to in the forum. I've been trying to figure out how to make sure you watch these things, and this is one of the things I decided. So I'm going to have you answer this question for the forum, and I will know that you answered this. What normative age-graded influences, normative history-graded influences, and non-normative or highly individualized life events influenced your development, and perhaps even your decision to become a professional counselor? How are these influences different from those of your parents, siblings, and friends? I'd like you to think about it, and I'd like you to respond in the forum. I don't want you to respond with something that you don't want others to see, but respond with something that you can reflect upon. Respond, how these different normative, age-graded, normative history-graded, and non-normative, highly individualized, how did they influence your development? And I'll see that response from you in the forum. Okay. And then we have critical periods versus flexibility and plasticity. So critical periods of development believe that there's only a certain amount of time that exists where we have the maximum opportunity for growth. And basically when that ends, that's it. There's certain examples of this. So the first 8 weeks of development in utero, and different diseases that could be contracted during a certain trimester of pregnancy. Evidence for critical periods has been found in the imprinting behaviors of new ducklings. They will bond with the first moving object they see, and it can be a human instead of a duck. But more recently, there are more proponents for the sensitive period, and that means there's more flexibility for these periods of time, and they're more flexible, and you can meet that developmental milestone later on in life. There could be things that could help you, um, and it's a little bit more flexible than critical. So developmental theorists also debate active versus passive development. Active development is the viewpoint that children actively construct their own worlds and initiate their own growth, even to unconscious choices made by the individuals. And then versus passive, which means the children are completely passively shaped by their environments, their parents, socioeconomic status, etc. But researchers agree that both are true. So embracing both active and passive development are important as a counselor. Then we go to nature versus nurture. Again, two dichotomies, right? Nature versus nurture. Old debate. Nature, biological, nurture, environment. And you already know. You guys are You already know. Both, right? Both influence. We have so many articles that definitely show us the interaction of genetics and environment and how powerful it is. Oh, there we go. Interaction of genetics and environment. All right, guys. Sometimes it gets stuck in this word. Okay. So we know that the interaction of genetics and environment do affect development and affect behavior. And one term, when we talk about the interaction of genetics and environment, is canalization. That starts with those are the genes that are kind of predetermined for all of us, pretty much. So language. What's another one? Um, that's a good example. So let's just put that basically it's canalized in our development that we're probably going to start talking at a certain point. But we do know that different environmental impacts can slow that down. For example, economically disadvantaged environments are at risk for permanently impaired cognitive, academic, and socio-emotional development. So even a child with a genetic disposition to be smart may struggle in school because of a deprived home environment. And this is what we see with the ACEs study, the Average Childhood Experiences study. And this is what we see the impact of those events and how they cause all sorts of issues, biological, social, and psychological issues later in life. So there's another study to reference. So genes set the boundaries for trait expression. Genes and environmental input determine exactly where a trait's expression will fall within that genetically predisposed range. So genes set the upper and lower limits on trait expression, and the environment determines the final outcome. So genes determine what we're capable of doing, but the environment determines what we actually do. This is very evident in research, like I just mentioned. So we have different types of genes that influence the environments we experience. We have a passive genotype environment, evocative genotype environment, and active genotype environment correlations. So let's start with the passive genotype environment correlation. The passive genotype environment correlation is basically when both parents have the genes for it biologically and the environment for the child. So the example in the text talks about both artistic parents, right? They're both talented artistically. And so passing that down to their child genetically and also through environment. So they're giving them art supplies and creating an environment to really increase the artistic capabilities of the child. Evocative genotype environment is actually about the features of the child. They evoke some kind of reactions from others around him, perhaps very tall, so basketball player, long fingers, piano player, limber, gymnast, right? And so the child's genotype influence the environment provided for them. And then there's active genotype environment correlation. This is when children seek out what their genetic makeup signals to them. So, and they seek it out and create their own environment because they have that inherent quality, like a personality characteristic, like being outgoing and open to new experience, a risk taker. Well, they're going to seek out those experiences, and that will shape their life. Um, if they're able to increasingly set those environmental niches, that can go in one way, or if they're not, another. Okay. The genetic contributions, epigenesis, because I wanted to say epigenetics, which is basically that's the same thing. Epigenesis. Environments that shape our genetic expressions, which further shape our environments. We know this to be true. This has been proven time and time again. The environment affects the initial gene expression. For example, hormone levels are affected by experiences in the environment, such as length of sunlight on a given day, nutrition, toxins, and stress. I talked about this with suppressed cortisol in those studies I referenced earlier. Very, very important in how they affect and interact with the environment. So hormone levels affect protein production and can thus turn on certain genes to allow for their phenotypic expression or keep them shut off. The concept of the environment acting to turn off genes is well illustrated in the link between early childhood abuse and resilience. Among the children who experienced early childhood abuse, a certain genetic subset showed resilience and effectively avoided maladaptive development. Children who had certain genetic structures were resilient in the face of child abuse. So those with resilient alleles had less chance of psychopathology compared to those without the resilient alleles. And where do you think we got the resilient alleles? Ah, genetics, right? Even passed down. Even in situations of higher environmental risk. In situations of low environmental risk, however, the two groups of children had similar outcomes because the allele was not turned on by the experience. This provides evidence that children may experience similar things differently due to their different genotypes. I cannot stress to you how important it is for you to understand this for your own well-being and for your understanding of clients and the way that you perceive everything in our field. So many scientists have tried to define this, and they try to define heritability is the trait or extent to which those expressions of a trait is genetically determined. Heritability is usually represented as a heritability quotient, or the percentage of variation in trait expression that can be attributed to genetic factors. Researchers have demonstrated that children's activity level has high heritability. So genetics play a large role in the hyperactivity and impulsivity that characterize children with ADHD. Please make sure you read the studies on page 16 about heritability. It's very important that you have a grasp of the impact of heritability and the interaction with environment. So the bottom especially, and I won't read it all to you or go over it all. And then we have environmental contributions, family, socioeconomic status, school, culture. Are they from an individualistic culture, collectivistic culture? Collectivist, are they in a single parent family? Are they in poverty? Do they have all their needs met? And how those interact and affect the outcomes. So we know that children who come from affluent homes are less aggressive and do well, but they also may suffer from issues like anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. Sorry, my child came in, so sometimes I abruptly stop because I'm recording these at home with my whole family here. So also, children living in poverty have an increased risk for health, behavioral, and social problems. I've mentioned this multiple times, but lower IQ, lower behavior regulation. Homeless children often are more sick, more likely than their house peers to have problems with all sorts of issues, anxiety, depression, speech and language development, social skills. They're aggressive. We're going to discuss poverty in a little bit when we talk about Bronfenbrenner's model. Your neighborhood is often linked with SES, so it depends on where they live. What dangerous communities could lead to poor social skills and adjustment issues. Home violence increase. So read through this. It's really important. How the teachers, peers, and school interact, really important. This is our advocacy, where we advocate for kids who are in traumatic, and I say traumatic, what I'm talking about are the things we just mentioned. It's very important for all of us as therapists to advocate for our clients. So I've had to do this a lot in the school system where, they just think they get labeled a bad kid, and I get a hold of it, and I realize I get a hold of the case, and they don't have food. They've had 7 deaths in their family. Mom has a new boyfriend, and they're acting out at school because they feel safe there and they're trying to get someone to notice, but they don't understand that's why they're doing it. And that's where your job comes in to become an advocate and call the school, get a release, and start doing some team work with the school counselor, teacher, education. I educated a lot of teachers and others at Hogansville about trauma recently and other situations. And then I got the case to someone who I thought would really help them. So really, really important for us. And then also making sure we understand the cultural impact. So as Americans, we have a more individualistic culture. We strive to teach our children to be independent, right? At any cost, right? Independence, be an individual, but that is not what it is like in other cultures, like Japan. That's a collectivist, collectivist worldview. That has a profound impact, right, on the different way that we perceive everything on how child rearing practices take place. So let's move on to the ecological model of child development. We're going to talk about Brothenbrenner's model, and this is something that you're going to need to know for your exam, for quiz with me, and also for your examinations. So the ecological model of child development can be used as a broad theoretical framework to understand environmental contributions. Brothenbrenner, 1994, he created this in the 70s. It became very popular and it's been accepted and used since then. He believed that the developing child is continually influenced by the systems within which the child is embedded. Hello. Yes. Oh my gosh. So important. And you got to know all these words, which you may have learned before in your undergrad. But so the reciprocal enduring interactions between the developing child and his environment are termed proximal processes. So that's the parent-child activities or play with group of peers. Not only does the child interact with these various systems, but the systems interact with each other to influence the child. So let's talk about Brothenbrenner's model here. So let's go through each system, starting with the individual and moving out to the macrosystem. That's how you read this. To the individual and what makes up the individual, and then that goes into the microsystem, which is a pattern of activities, social roles, and interpersonal relations experienced in a face-to-face setting with most notably the family, the daycare, these immediate systems that the child is in contact with, right? And so not only is the child influenced by family, community, schools, and peers, but influences them as well. So the various factors of family, neighborhood, and school discussed above will be considered microsystems. The mesosystem is the connection between two of those systems. So let's talk about linking perhaps your neighborhood and your school, or your home and your school. So problems in the microsystem can spill over into other microsystems as well. So the exosystem is the connection and relationship between two or more settings, but one of which the child is not experiencing directly. So let's say, for instance, that the home and the parent's workplace. There could be issues in the parent's workplace, but the child has no awareness of that. And so it's outside of their awareness, but it's indirectly influencing the child and how they interact with the systems. And that brings us to the macro system, which is the overarching cultural context in which all the other systems are embedded. So this is where we have the various beliefs, values, customs, lifestyles, etc. And in addition to the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem, Brothenbrenner also has the chronosystem to capture the influence of time on the developing person, so chronological chronosystem. So adding that in, it's not in the diagram right there, but it's after macrosystem. So the changes experienced by a child through development and the historical and social events of the time have a potential to hugely affect how the child develops and who they become, and that is happening right now. I mean, really think about that. Think about the impact of COVID-19. My child just wanted her friend to come over today, and we haven't been doing that because of this. And how is that? What are the effects long term? It's just going to be interesting to see. what happens. So let's do a case example of Brofenbrenner here on 21. I want you guys to read through this. I feel like I'm giving you time to read through it. Why am I doing that? Hopefully I'll make y'all laugh some while I'm doing this, but I was like, I'm just gonna be quiet and read this together silently. Anyway, read that on your own instead of me reading it too. I don't even know. Y'all have to tell me what's better. Me to read it through? Maybe I'll try that. Let's read it together. All right. The achievement gap is a serious problem in America today. Children of low socioeconomic status are consistently outperformed by higher socioeconomic status peers. One explanation is that children of poverty do not receive as much cognitive stimulation in a warm, supportive environment as their more economically advantaged peers. Here we see how lack of stimulation and warmth at home can result in problems with emotional regulation and academic achievement at school. That's the mesosystem, that interaction between the two systems. Expectancies and values in various microsystems can either support or conflict with one another. Conflicts between expectancies and values at home and in school can be very problematic. Using the conflict of microsystems as a basis for explanation, another reason for the achievement gap is that expected modes of interaction at home and in-school conflict for low SES and match for middle and high SES children. Thus, the relationship between the microsystems of home and school for children of low SES results in a problem mismatch that harms their academic potential. Children growing up in poverty get less cognitive stimulation at home and learn modes of interaction with their parents that do not match the way they're expected to behave in school. Living in impoverished circumstances can result in chronic economic stress, which can cause parents to experience mental health problems, less marital satisfaction, low self-esteem. The emotional distress experienced by parents living in poverty is linked to less nurturing and less responsive parenting practices, which are harmful to children's well-being and academic achievement. So one can see how the reciprocal relationship between the parent and neighborhood exosystem can influence a child's development. That's the exosystem. And the macrosystem are the values and lifestyles. Growing up in poverty may look different from typical American values by middle class or higher SES. Economically disadvantaged children are likely to place a strong value on family relationships and view obtaining daily necessities for survival as paramount. This contrasts with middle class values of negotiation, competition, individualism, and future orientation. There's no future orientation in poverty. It is easy to see how the pervasive influence of social and historical contexts affect child development, especially when one considers the overlay of the chronosystem, such as during an economic downturn, or right now. This book was written before right now. So anyway, that's a great example. I want you to read that and understand that so that if, perhaps I ask you a question for you to explain a case using the systems, you could do that. That would be great. That would be great. Theory structures common in human development. This will never end, this chapter. I'm going to give you guys some pointers and tell you guys to break this up in 2 days. So you only watch half of it at once, because I realize these are the slides from the text and they're boring. They're just basic slides. I'm trying to make it as interesting as I can. I find it very interesting, but I don't know if you will listening to me for 2 hours. Here we go. Theory structures. So we're moving into something different. So human development across the lifespan changes abruptly via rapid stage theories say that when we talk about stage, that's Piaget and Erickson, right? So that helps you to kind of understand that a little bit better. And then we also have incremental theories and multidimensional theories. Incremental are different than stage. So and we talked about this with that dichotomous and continuous variables in the beginning with the stages. So this is the similar, the theory behind it, right? And so incremental is essentially the opposite of staged. Rather than viewing development as long periods of stability interrupted by drastic qualitative changes in functioning, It's more gradual, continuous, that continuous that we talked about earlier, continuous development. Um, it's not, it's steady and gradual, but there's room for flexibility. B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning is perhaps one of the best examples of incremental theory. Skinner proposed that random behaviors produce favorable or unfavorable outcomes. So when a behavior is met with a favorable outcome, we can increase it or we can reinforce it. Reinforcers can be positive, such as providing a desired reward, or negative, such as removing an aversive stimulus. Unfavorable outcomes or punishments decrease. Well, we're going to go over that later. I don't need to talk about that right now. So we can shape behavior in some ways, right? And we're not in these set stages. And then we have a multi-dimensional theory. Development is characterized by continuity and discontinuity. Emphasis on reciprocal influences in development. Of course, those multidimensional theories are the combination of both, which we mentioned earlier in the lecture, right? It's the acknowledgement of the continuity and discontinuity of the stages. So I think that is really important to note as we continue. Now we're moving into counseling perspectives, normal versus abnormal development. So framing situations from a normal developmental perspective. Culture determines what is considered good versus bad, healthy versus unhealthy, and normal versus abnormal, right? So aspects of development that can be viewed from a normative perspective for children of most cultures are developmental milestones of maturation and the task approach of Arnold Giselle, physical, cognitive, language, and personal social developmental markers that should be achieved by certain ages. If a child is not meeting, normal developmental milestones, that does alert us. I mean, when you take your child for their checkups, you expect that they've started to babble or talk, walk, etc. And if they haven't by a certain point, now sometimes, we're flexible with that stage, but it's a time for us to start to figure out what is going on, right? So a lot of, across the whole world, if children aren't talking by a certain point, they're going to be evaluated or they're going to try to figure out what's going on. Are they going to get a speech therapist? Are they going to have more hearing tests? Or, what kind of research are we going to do? Or are they in an abusive environment and they're not talking? What is happening that is delaying that developmental milestone? So that is across the board for most cultures. And abnormal is the deviant from the norm, distressing, dysfunctional, or potentially dangerous to the individual or others. Abnormal, Because norms for conduct differ cross-culturally, even across subgroups, the definition of abnormality may vary across cultures. So it's really important to remember that as we are looking at clients. Another critical part of the definition of abnormality is dysfunctional. This means that an individual is experiencing abnormal thoughts, behaviors, or emotions and is just so distracted they can't live normally and go about their life in a productive manner. The nosological classification system is a clinical way of determining abnormality and making a diagnosis. So, of course, you guys already have this class in DSM-5 and you already understand how this works. You have a nosological classification system that helps you through the DSM-5 to make sense of mental disorders. When we see an abnormality and that in that area, or when they meet the criteria, then we can make a diagnosis. There are a lot of criticisms of the DSM-5. In fact, between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 being written, it was an interesting time to be in school because I was getting my doctorate, finishing up my PhD, and there were so many people going back and forth with their input, their research about what should go in and what shouldn't go in. So much criticism of the DSM. And if you think back, and I try to always remind you guys, because I'm not a huge proponent of DSM, of diagnoses, but of course I have to use them. I take all insurance at this point. I think right now everything but Peach State Medicaid I take, and so I have to get a diagnosis. I'm very, very cognizant of what I'm doing with that and very aware and make sure I have ways to back up the diagnosis that I'm giving. But it's also, so I definitely understand it, but it's also can really put people in a box. So there's a lot of criticisms. And like I said before in foundations, like if you think back to PTSD came out in 1980 in the DSM-3, homosexuality used to be a disorder. So I think that you've really got to be open-minded when you think about this. And so using your gut and your clinical judgment and making sure you keep that in the forefront of your mind forever, because when we have the DSM-6, a lot of the diagnoses in 5 might be discredited or done away with or changed and modified. Very, very important. I think personality disorders is the thing that we're going to see next because I see treatment for those in EMDR when we treat trauma. I see those symptomology start to go away. So for me, it's really interesting to see if I think that stigma with those, like in 20 years, will be something we're pretty horrified by, and we'll change the way that we look at it and treat it as something more treatable than static over time. Okay, let's keep going. You guys can read about that. I'm not gonna, my gosh, we're almost down here an hour. Let's see, studying human development. All right, how do we study human development? Well, you just also had, yes, individual analysis. So you also just learned about data collection methods and should be really up to date on that. And I love our new schedule because it's very helpful for you to have all of that prior to now. Make sure you remember, even though it's not in the PowerPoint, internal validity and external validity. The internal validity is the soundness of the study. How valid is the internal consistency of that study? It can confidently determine that the change in the dependent variable, which is outcome, is due to the conditions that we introduced as researchers, which is an independent variable, and not due to other confounding variables, right? Versus external validity. This is the generalizability to the outside population. And so making sure that you remember those two for the future. We have different kinds of data collection methods. So one of them is standardized testing. This is like your standard GRE, your SAT, your CPCE, your NCE based on norms. So for the CPCE, your scores are based on January norms. So the January test comes out. And natural, so I think I said that. I was in the middle of something and my phone dinged and I stopped. So let me get back to the CPCE is based on norms from January test administration. And so in some ways it's not great, right? Because that's just one sample in January of students who took the test. And then that average, the mean and the standard deviation, one standard deviation above and below the mean is what we base our scores off of. So we look at your scores to make sure you got within either that average or one standard deviation above or below. So that gives you an idea of, there's the phone again. I probably should turn that off, right? That would be helpful. Things you learn when you're starting to record lectures. Naturalistic observation. This is when you observe in a natural environment. So you're not disturbing anything. You're really trying to not even let anyone know that you are there and so that you won't have any kind of reactivity. So where people act differently when they know they're being observed versus a structured observation. This is where we actually are observing in a structured experiment. And I love the example is the study that came out with the bystander effect, which is where one person, if they're alone in the room and they smell smoke, they call for help. But if they are with other people in the room and they have a more passive stance, then they're less likely to report it when with passive others. So it's really interesting that external validity may not have been compromised because the results attained in these structured observations, they may not transfer to the real world. But we know that this is, the bystander effect is something that we already know is proven, but it's really interesting. I love that study, and that's something you should know about the bystander effect if you don't remember it from Psych 101. Okay. And a case study. These are case studies. These are the types of research that we can do as counselors a lot. We can do these case studies. They're an open-ended, in-depth examination of a single individual, family, or small group. It can be done through observation, testing, examination of their case. We can do a case study in a multitude of ways. I think most of you are familiar with all this, and I'm probably just reviewing. And then self-report is another way of obtaining more information. We self-report assessment tools, etc. So these are very important in the way that we gather data. Oh, I did internal and external validity, so that's already done. So let's move on to different research designs commonly used in human development. You're going to be in research this summer, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, but these are the different kind of research designs. A longitudinal design is over a period of time where you measure at certain points. The average childhood experiences study is a good example of a longitudinal study. They are long and expensive. There are lots of problems with longitudinal research, but they do, in fact, give us a ton of data. These studies have really helped us understand the impact, especially in trauma. And then we have a cross-sectional design. The cross-sectional designs measure individuals of different ages at a single point in time. This approach allows researchers the opportunity to determine the average behavior and characteristics of people of a certain age, but no conclusions here can be reached about the continuity of development. So then we also have cohort effect, which is a certain age group, right? Sequential methods measures multiple age cohorts at multiple intervals over time, which effectively allows researchers to pinpoint which observed differences are due to maturation and which are due to shared historical or generational experiences. Sequential methods enhance generalizability of the results. Time lag designs and cross-cultural research. Time lag are also known as cohort sequential studies, and they're replications of previous studies. Cross-cultural research is conducted in order to eliminate the differences and similarities among various people of diverse cultures. All right, in a review of ethical principles, I think you guys know these, so just remember beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy. Please review those and know those. Those are going to be on your test. You're going to see those multiple times. CPCE, NCE, so memorize them, know them now. Informed consent, totally have to have that for participation in human development research and in counseling. So confidentiality, we already know this. You've taught it so many times. Just a quick, it's always good to review. You'll know that these textbooks, when you review, it's helping you to prepare for your examinations and for the field. Concepts of deception, we cannot justify when the potential benefits outweigh the risk and there's no alternative way to achieve desired results. Debriefing is especially important when deception is used. So really, really important as a researcher that you understand deception and what that is. It's only justified, like I said, when the benefits outweigh the risk, but you have to debrief them so that they understand what they've gone through. We've done some terrible deception in our history with these studies, which is why we have an IRB now. Kind of like the Milgram study, where people thought they killed someone with the electric shock. With the white coat, when the white coat guy came in, the doctor came in, told him to increase the shock. Powerful study that we thank you. We know so much now about the power of the role in the doctor, right? And that we will do things when they tell us to do these things, kind of like akin to how all the Germans did the things in the Holocaust. But nonetheless, I can only imagine what happened to those poor people who thought they killed people in the study. I'm sure they were severely traumatized for God knows how long. So yes, we have to be very careful with this, and we have to be culturally sensitive. We have to be careful, and the interpretation of the results of the study. Okay, I think we're finished. Oh my gosh, look at that, guys. We just have our reflection questions. I already kind of asked you this, right? So this is that reflection question I want you to move back toward when you answer the forum. So please go back to what I referenced earlier in the lecture. And we did it. We're done. Yay. Now on to chapter 2. You guys both did it in an hour and 4 minutes. I hope you're not too bored. Bye-bye.